The Magnus archives, the gay horrors that slammed into my door, beat the shit out of me, took my money, and I said thank you. The series that I desperately want to force all my friends to see, but they all turn to me and say, I don't listen to podcasts. Oh well, this fucking thing took control over my life and has a stupidly rich and somewhat complicated lore with a lot of confusingly straightforward things. It's the type of thing that is straightforward enough that feels like you could market it, but at the same time is confusing enough that is going to make an entire fandom go insane over it. The Magnus Archives is a supernatural cosmic horror podcast that focuses on godlike beings that represent fear. In that world, the strange and paranormal stuff that happens in day-to-day life are mostly caused by them. And they can be primarily divided into 15 fears. And that's all to say that this podcast is about some cool fear gods who do some spooky shit. And you can get superpowers from them. You just gotta trade your humanity, which, honestly, fair. And also, these entities are pretty wild in the story, so I thought, oh, why not I don't do a video talking about them and explaining about them, which in a way is very weird, because if you've seen the Magnus Archives, you already know this stuff, and if you haven't seen the Magnus Archives, most of this is spoilers. So I don't really know what this video is for, who this video is for that matter, but I'm gonna do it anyways. Before jumping into it, I would like to say that this series can get pretty confusing sometimes. So a lot of the things that I'm gonna be saying are a little bit of my interpretation of it. So if you've seen the Magnus Archives and you listen to something that are like, oh, this isn't what I thought this was, like, don't worry, this is probably just how I understood how it was. And if you haven't listened to the Magnus Archives, just take everything that I say with a tiny pinch of salt in a way, because again, a lot of interpretive stuff that you can do. And I would also like to explain how this will work. First, I'm gonna explain the basis of what the fear I'm talking about is, and talk about their motifs and themes through the series. Then I'm gonna talk about like its kind of positive themes that you can also get from them, and its various alternative ways that you can interpret them. And then I'm going to talk about the servants of the fears, which are the things that I mentioned previously. Basically, on the world of the Magnus Archives, there's basically kind of two types. I'm saying this with... It's hard to explain, but basically, there are monsters and creatures who are kind of spawned out of these spheres, and they're like exist by being part of this large entity. And there's also people and also animals in general, who can become part of these entities. And normally the series calls these other beings that become part of these entities as avatars. And one of my favorite things in the series is that it's like an avatar, different types of avatars from different entities. They have different personalities and also different powers and different sorts of organizations between them, which I find extremely cool. So I'm going to talk about that too. The thing that all of these like beings from these entities kind of share between each other is that they all feed off of fear. So they all need to act like creepy cryptids and hunt and prey over normal people in order to like survive and gain more power and stuff like that. So in a way, the way that the entities and the avatars are presented in the series is a lot like Hogwarts houses in a way, if wizards actively harassed people. And also if Harry Potter wasn't made by a transphobe. Anyways, so let us begin. First, let's start by the elephant in the room. We can call the eye. The eye is probably the most, at least in the podcast, the most important entity in the podcast, simply because it's the protagonist entity. A lot of the main characters are affiliated with the eye in some sort of way. It represents the fear of being watched or of awful knowledge that can destroy you, having your secrets exposed, or just generally the lack of privacy. Those are fears that are related to the eye. It's also known as the beholding or the ceaseless watcher. And it basically is the dread that you feel when you realize that, like, your entire life since you were born is probably archived and filed up by Google and Amazon, and that every single device that you have probably listens to all single conversations that you have. Yeah, that's the eye, basically. It also is the fear that you are suffering for the enjoyment or the advantage, and this fear that you're suffering for something else. I normally associate it a little bit with that idea of the cold scientist that does something in the name of science. You know, that's my interpretation here. But I kind of see it as like, you know how sometimes people will inflict pain in others just for the sake of knowing what happens, like an experiment. And again, like that idea of the mad scientist of doing awful things for, like, in the name of something and causing suffering for others for an objective, let's say. That's also something that is related to the eye. The good thing about the eye is something that even though it's not explicitly said through the series, it is something that is heavily, I think, implied and shown in a way, which is the thing that when you know about something, when you have knowledge over something, that thing is normally not as scary or threatening as you think it is. Like, our mind play tricks on us, and a lot of times knowing the truth can be very freeing. So that knowledge and that understanding that the world is not as scary as you probably think it is, or like just general knowledge is a good thing. Those things can be considered good sides of the eye. Personality-wise, the avatars of the eye, I would say they all have one thing in common, which is the thing that they're really punchable. Like, they all have the personality of the nerd who knows what is going on and will make sure that it knows what is going on. You know what I mean? They can be arrogant, and they kind of act like that one kid in class that every class has, that when the teacher forgets that there's homework, it very much will raise their hand and remind the teacher that there's homework. That's like the image of the eye avatar. They're normally also extremely curious, and they also don't have a clear idea of boundaries in a lot of ways. They search knowledge and have objectives, and they won't see like limits in those sorts of pursuits. As for how the avatars of the eye are organized, the series makes it extremely clear, because again, this is like the kind of protagonist entity. They are normally organized in institutes. research institutes, and and those people who serve the eye, they feed themselves over the fear that people who go to these institutes that normally research supernatural, people go there with fear from the things that happen around them, and they feed off of that fear. It's kind of implied that there's different levels of eye avatar in a way, that there's some sort of hierarchy going on, because there's the archivist, which is kind of like just an eye avatar but stronger, basically. Or like more important, like that's something that is kind of implied in the series, and I might as well just add on here. Another note, most entities just despise the eye in all senses possible. The eye doesn't have a lot of allies, let's say, between the other fears, basically because of the thing that I already said earlier about normally when you know something is not as scary. So normally other fears that aren't reliant on people knowing what they are and that they exist, let's say. Other fears that aren't reliant on that normally really hate the eye because it makes the job harder for them. Another reason why they hate the eye is because, again, as I said before, the eye also feeds off of fear that is generated by other entities through statements and sightings of the supernatural that goes to those eye institutes. So they also don't like that because it kind of feels like, I don't know, someone's stealing your job. But I do have two main allies within the other entities, which are the lonely, and the web. Okay, so now we're gonna talk about the corruption. The corruption is one of the most uncomfortable fears, or at the very least, it is for me. But I also think the corruption is one of the most interesting fears, symbolic-wise. It is the fear of pestilence, be of sickness and bugs and rots and infestations. Those are all things that are related to the corruption. But it also has the motif of toxic relationships, toxic, parasitic, interpersonal things that you have in your life. Like, for example, abusive relationships or hive mentality, toxic patriotism. So those are all things that are related to the corruption in some sort of way, which to me is pretty genius, but also because there's such a variety of things that can be corruption. There's also a big variety of avatars of the corruption. There's avatars that are related to the sickness part. There's others that are related to the bug side. There's others that are just like rot, mold, and etc. So so they're very expensive on the corruption spectrum of things, which is also ironic because I think it's one of the entities that it's like the easiest to realize when a story or a statement or an episode is about it, because it's pretty disgusting. Normally when it gets real nasty, you know what it's referring to. But the thing, and exactly because of that, the one thing that all of the corruption servants have in common is that they all stink. They all smell. Join the corruption to be extremely stinky. The corruption also, because of its nature, doesn't have a really, it's not very organized. Like, we don't really see a lot of organization between the people who serve it, which to me is a big waste of opportunity, that one, because we don't see, there's a single statement in the entire podcast that talks about like a cult that is related to the corruption, which makes me kind of mad. There should be, considering the thematics of the entity, there should have at least a few more cults related to it. But anyways, also because of the motif of relationships regarding the corruption. There's normally the servants of the corruption and the people, the avatars, they're very needy people. They're people who want to be part of a whole, part of a hive. They want to sacrifice themselves in order to be something big. They're lonely people who don't want to be lonely in a way. And also because of the motif of like relationships and interpersonal stuff, it's also the fear that has some, quite a few sexual innuendos to it. Both sometimes, like, it's the one theory, there's a few statements where like sex is a theme. One of one of the first few episodes of the series is a warm sex episode about the corruption that is extremely traumatizing. I had nightmares with that episode. There's also the one where it's about a guy who fucked a giant beetle, or at least it's very much implied that he fucked a giant beetle. He at the very least married a giant beetle, which honestly, good for him, I guess. The good side of the corruption is, well, having relationships is something good, and that's something that is extremely related to it. Sometimes it's nice to be part of something big, and sometimes it's nice to like have this sort of love for things that are disgusting, like that theme of loving things that other people reject. That's also something that is heavily like, that is very, very much part of the symbology of the corruption. In a way, we're all being afflicted by the corruption, in a way, currently. Yeah. So next one. The Buried. The Buried is the fear, is basically claustrophobia. It's also like fear of being underground, dirt, being tombed, and having like things around. It's claustrophobia. It's also related to the feeling of pressure, like general pressure. It is related to that feeling that you have when you have just a ton of work and a ton of things to do, and living life feels like it physically hurts because you just have all of this pressure, and it feels like every single thing you do is just super important, and any single thing that you do will ruin your life. It also has a motif of like coffins, because of that idea of being entombed, like that fear of being buried alive, basically, was also used in a way to like represent how a lot of people sometimes just get tired of how hard it is to live life. It also represents that feeling of just wanting to dig yourself in the ground and just forget about everything that is going on. Like, you do not exist anymore. Now I'm embraced by the earth. This is also a feeling of the buried. There aren't a lot of avatars that were shown in the story related to the buried. There were a few people that were heavily implied to have been searched or marked by the buried in the story, and there is like one example of an obvious avatar in a statement that wasn't actually super relevant to what was going on in the story proper. But what is shown is that people who are related to the buried are normally people who are very, very into digging, very into just going and stuff, and very much. And the one guy that we can see clearly the personality that is obviously an avatar of the buried, got extremely popular in the fandom for talking things like, oh, don't you want to just be embraced and have a little rest in the mud? A good thing of the buried and a good theme of it is the idea of having things that ground you, like having particular hobbies or houses or jobs or things that keep you grounded and keep you somewhat safe. It has a little bit of a safety and just isolation theme to it that can be interpreted as actually nice and comforting if you see it that way. And it has the theme of just having responsibilities and etc. And that can be good. For allies, it isn't very focused. There isn't a lot of focus on that, but there is note that a lot of people remark how the buried and the vast, which is another fear that I'm going to talk later, are extremely related because they're absolute opposites of each other. So they absolute contradict and at the same time kind of relate in a way. And I'm going to talk a little bit more deeper about that when I talk about the vast. The dark. The dark is the fear of the dark. Very straightforward. It's probably one of the most straightforward fears in the list, but it also has a motif, a thematic motif with imagination and also with religion in a way, because the dark, by its very nature, is a fear that it is extremely irrational and only exists because our mind fills in the gaps of the things that we can see. So because of it, it is extremely related to children, and also it also has a thematic link in the story with pseudoscience of, again, things that like are filled in with our imagination. Imagine a flat earther. You know how flat earth people basically deep down they know that what they doing, that like what they believe doesn't make any sort of sense, and no matter how much you try to explain to them that it doesn't make any sort of sense, it won't matter, because they firmly believe, because they want to believe that what they believe is true. And that's something that is thematically related to the dark. The avatars of the dark are very much related to that. Most of them in the story are presented in a cult, having like a cult sort of organization that actively praise the dark in a way that sounds really insane. In a way, it's listening in the podcast to the avatars of the dark is extremely insane. They just sound so lost. They're actively like praise the dark, praise the darkness of your soul, and most of their activity and power also come exactly from the thing of imagination. Like, I took a very long time to understand how, like, the powers of the dark avatars even work, because, like, how can the dark even actively hurt you? And in the story, very interesting, it's normally the dangers of the dark are very much portrayed in a lot of times as like either like suffocating darkness that you can't see, and because you can't see it, you feel lost and you feel like you're in the dark forever, it actively hurts you, or like creatures, darkness creatures that eat you, because that's kind of like the assumption that we have with like darkness, the creativity that we have with darkness. Also, there's like some specific statements of the dark that really fucking reminds me of Five Nights of Freddy's 4, and how like there's these creatures that are almost like darkness like, that are afraid of light. A lot of like how things work in FNAF is a little bit how the powers of the dark work in a way. Just creatures that will attack you if you're in darkness. As for the relationships relating to the dark, it's very much thematically wise. It's extremely opposed to the eye, which, as I said before, a lot of the fears just really hate the eye. But the dark in particular has a few themes and symbols that actively goes against the idea of the eye, exactly because in the case of the eye, it's like, oh, I'm gonna know the truth, exactly what it is, and it's like everything exposed, while the dark is very much the opposite. It's everything in darkness, everything hidden, and very much creating your own truth in a way, creating the gaps of filling with your imagination the things that you don't understand, and your creativity and your imagination turning things back to life. And because of this, these two fears are very much against each other in a way. That's also like the good side of the dark that you can see. Trying to find the good side of the dark was really hard, as the way, like, it's such a straightforward fear that it was really hard to interpret in a way that you can get good themes out of it, or at least for me. Technically, imagination is good, creativity is good. You don't need to go full pseudoscience, but be able to create things with your mind and be able to believe things simply for the sake of believing things can be good. The vast. The vast is pretty much fear of heights, and fear of like big, incomprehensible things, of being small. It's the dread when you feel when you're like in an extremely open, empty space where you just feel absolutely, utterly small. Yeah, that's the vast. Its themes is, as I said before, extreme, like feeling small regarding of in regards to the universe. It has a great nihilistic energy to its statements and to its meaning, let's say. It has this theme of extreme nihilism, of being absolutely, utterly insignificant in regards to the entire universe. It also has been used as like as metaphor for how your actions and how your and how little weight your actions actually have, and how no matter how much you try, you're not going to be able to do much about like the problems that you may want to do, and like how much, no matter how hard you try, you're not going to be able to do significant changes or significant impact into the things around you. Because of that, the avatars of the vast have an extremely chill personality. It's all of them, they're extremely chill to the point of being almost funny. Their power is also really fun because avatars of the vast can fly, and they can also make you be basically trapped in a like state of feeling like you're falling eternally, which is extremely hard to imagine. Just you're like, you're there, but it feels like you're falling. They have this mentality of, no matter, like, I can do whatever the fuck I want, everyone can do whatever the fuck they want, because you know what, doesn't matter, that type of extremely nihilistic behavior, that which can also be positive in a way. Well, it's played off of fear, and of course that extreme nihilism is extremely negative, when the thought that you can't change anything no matter how hard you try is an extremely negative thought, and the story makes sure for you to know this. But at the same time, it's also positive because it's extremely freeing. The idea that, like, oh, if nothing matters, then let's just do things, that type of mentality can be good, can be extremely free. As I mentioned before, it is the exact opposite of the buried, both in thematics as it is in fear, as in fear of heights, fear of being tombed, fear of being pressured, and of all your things having so much, and all your actions have so much weight to them that, like, you can't do anything, that you feel trapped. And the other side, which is you can do anything. It's like you're fighting against nothing, and no matter how hard you try, all your attempts are just going to be lost in the immense sea of the universe, that sort of thing. So they're absolutely in immense opposites. Another thing that I would like to point out is that thematically wise, the vast both has is extremely connected to the sky, obviously heights, as it is also extremely related to the ocean, and the idea of the ocean being so extensive and deep and powerful that they're just swallowed by it. It's enormous. It's enormous, and that idea of something that we don't know, we can't control, it's so big, it's also related to the vast. And interesting point is that the ocean can also be related to the buried. So even though they're absolute opposites, they also have interlap, which is the ocean. You can also feel pressured, and you can also be entombed in a way by the ocean. That pressure can also occur there. So it's an interesting interlap there. Hello, I am in different clothing now because it's a different day. And I'm also without makeup because I didn't want to put makeup. I just hope that the webcam camera quality makes my face look decent. The spiral, now presented with loose hair. The spiral is a very interesting fear. It's the fear of madness, the fear that your mind and your senses are lying to you. That type of fear can be presented in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of spiral statements that just feel extremely out of left field compared to the other ones, because there's a lot of variety of the spiral statements. The fear of your mind lying to you can be manifested in a lot of different ways. Some examples, one of the most iconic ones in the series is doors that seem to have come out of nowhere, things that appear out of nowhere, things that disappear out of nowhere. You doubting yourself. There's an episode about like gaslighting regarding to the spiral. Because of that nature of being a fear that is intrinsically related to lying, its avatars are extremely wild too. There's a continuously theme of the human mind and how we doubt ourselves, and how certain things and certain aspects of our lives that we obsess over, and how little details of your life can drive us mad, or even the fear of or even sometimes how the fear of being mad can drive us mad, which is something very interesting. And there's even an episode talking about how of like fear of your problems being your own, like mental illness, of like fear of not being crazy basically, and all of the things around you just being your fault, which is a genius concept. Just this general idea of like you're not being able to trust your own instincts, and that can be interpreted in a lot of ways. Because of that, the avatars of the spiral are extremely wild. In the series, there aren't actually a lot of examples of them. Prominent example of a being of the spiral, but that being isn't exactly an avatar. The avatars itself that are referred to in the story are normally people who are like have very loose identity, they don't like to be contained in identity, let's say, and they are extremely ominous, even more than normal, and they give the feeling of not being people, exactly because it's that thing of like lies and stuff. That prominent figure of the spiral that is very present in the series is distortion, which is a thing that is very present in the spiral, in the story, that is extremely hard to explain. I do not want to explain the distortion here, because when I was listening to the podcast and it came to the time where the story was trying to explain the distortion, I started having a headache. I keep notes when I am listening to this because I'm making theories, and then there's a single episode that I just have to pause to try to understand the logistics of what is going on, and it gives me a headache, and that's the distortion. And I think it's extremely ironic that I feel that way, because that's pretty much the feeling that was probably intended. But it's extremely frustrating when you desperately want to make little sheets of understanding of world building in your head, and the story is just like, fuck you, here's the thing that is just extremely hard to explain, which is like this being that you can become, but it also eats you, and it is doors, but also is a person that became it, and I'm not gonna explain more than that. Also, another addendum, I think that the distortion in particular, and probably all of the other spiral avatars, they really talk like they're really high in a way. At the very least for me, I have this impression. It's not about the identity. I'm not a I don't know, they have that vibe of just being extremely high, of having absolutely losing it. Like, think of this spiral as like the media interpretation of LSD, like that absolute trip. Like, I don't know, that's the idea that most avatars of the spiral and other most avatars of the spiral and the creatures of the spiral, that's the energy that he has. As for relationships with other entities, it's an extremely chaotic entity in a lot of ways, so it's really hard to explain that. It really seems like it's a little bit more personal, as in like there's particular beings of the spiral who are fond of particular things of other entities. I don't know, it's not very fixed for the whole thing, but I would like to make a note that theme-wise the spiral is very similar to the stranger, which is another fear that I will explain later. So the next one is the lonely. I have a very deep-seated anger for the lonely. Maybe not the lonely. Maybe the characters in the lonely in the story made me extremely hateful of the lonely. Anyways, the lonely is the fear of being alone. It's the fear of being isolated. It's the fear of being lonely. The motif of the lonely is a very interesting one. It's very related to sea, like the feeling of being lonely at the sea, like those deep, extensive beaches that makes you feel extremely alone and small in the universe. So very interesting, a lot, interestingly, very interestingly, is that it's basically depression god. Basically, the lonely is used in the story a lot for like depression caused by isolation, or isolation that is caused by depression. Some types of anxiety, just general, like you hating yourself because you're the only person that you're around, and social and relationship problems that you can have with the other people around you that result on you being alone. And because of that, the lonely statements, I think that they are some of the ones that hit the hardest. It's a feat that, at least to me, really affects me. And the statements of the lonely are normally very much like extremely psychologically related. It's not a super material fear as some of the other ones have. So it ends up tackling with a lot of like more psychological details. Apparently, one thing that I found funny, apparently the author didn't mean it to be a depression metaphor until like until like season 5, and it was just like from season 4 people were like, oh, is this a depression metaphor? And then from there it actually became a depression metaphor because accidentally he made a depression metaphor, which is insane. Connecting to like the good side of the fear, one of the things the series makes it clear is how the lonely can seem very tempting, because some people just get tired of being around others, or just naturally more recluse. And to a certain extent, being able to be happy by yourself and loving yourself and having your space is good. The lonely kind of tricks you into going like that extra mile and accidentally just distance yourself from everyone and start become apathetic of everything because you're just so distant, which is an interesting thing to explore. um Going with that, the avatars of the lonely, exactly because of that nature, they're normally extremely apathetic about everything that goes on in their lives. They're normally very isolated, to an extent that it seems almost funny because they visibly don't want to be there. Their powers are like, the main one is like being able to turn invisible and also making other people disappear, which is also really funny because they can just point out at that people, be like, I do not like you, and make them disappear. And that person is sent to like the lonely itself, like the dimension, because as I said before, the fears, they're gods, but they're also like they're kind of like a place at the same time, in a way. So you can send people there, and they send just people there, and or turn them invisible. I think they can do both. But anyways, they can also control evil mist. That's another one of the lonely's motifs. It's evil mist that gives you anxiety. You touch the mist and you feel bad. That's another thing about the lonely. Also, that also reminds me, another symbol of the lonely is like the idea of being forgotten after that, like being forsaken and just being absolutely not remembered by anyone. That's another lonely fear, but I think that's more deep than what I'm trying to talk about here. But yeah, there was some like death. Like death is a thing. Death can be related to a lot of the fears, but like it has been used for the lonely because of that idea of like being forgotten, and which something that is, humanity is scared of that because it's lonely. So funny enough, the only big organization of avatars that we find in the series of like lonely avatars is constituted of a family, which to me is extremely interesting because families are normally portrayed in stories are like things of union and like you're not alone and etc. Well, this family is very much the opposite. Actually, like this family in the story, this family that is almost cult-like, it's kind of, I think it has been used a little bit as metaphor for like abusive family relationships, I think, like very, very briefly lately. They're also probably incels. They probably like have intercourse with that little, you know, the thing like the super prude people used to use in the past, that is like that sheet that has a hole in it, and people would like use it to make babies because they didn't want to touch each other. They probably use that. Once I was having a discussion because they probably use that. I doubt they would like to touch each other. Anyways, next one. The stranger. The stranger was a fear that I took a while to like fully differentiate from the spiral. I think like their concept is somewhat very similar, but then you realize what exactly it's talking about, and you go, oh, the stranger is the fear of things that look almost human, looks that feel familiar but aren't, and you feel, oh my god, I don't know what that is. It's like the fear of uncanny valley, basically. It's the thing that people have when they look at dolls and think like, holy shit, they're so creepy. Why do they have faces but those empty eyes? You know what I mean? or like clowns and biggest example for me of what like the stranger feels like, those games that are supposed to be like kind of surreal. It's not the feeling that you have when you see CGI that is bad, or like a video game, a 3D video game that has like low resolution graphics. Like for example, Baldur's Basics, and other games that have kind of that feel. Those that feeling like, oh, that is wrong. This is like what The Stranger is like. Every time I think of The Stranger, I also think of those YouTube playlists that are like mysterious places that you've seen in dreams, or like mysterious images that looks like something is wrong, with ominous music on the background. Like those are things that are very like The Stranger. Also, it also has like a theme of identity theft. Like the people from that fear commit a lot of identity theft. They also steal skin, so that's nice. Avatars of The Stranger have personality-wise the tendency of looking like seeing kind of dismissive about the idea of like having an identity and having a life and that type of stuff. They seem to really not have a lot of things that they define themselves as themselves. So they just kind of like take things around them and like start calling themselves those things. And they're also very extra, exactly because extreme things feel unnatural. So the stranger avatars feel very goofy in a way. So much so that the organization that they're normally like gather in, that was at least presented to us through the series, was a circus, because that's one of the places that feels like wrong, and where people can be extreme and not act like a regular person would act. So I think their main power would be something like, again, being able to shift their appearance and control their body parts. Maybe. I think it's very varied. The avatars of The Stranger, there has been a lot of debate. I have participated in a lot of debates regarding other people in the fandom regarding which people who serve the stranger would be considered avatars. But then like avatar is just like a term that exists in the podcast, so it doesn't matter. But like it's very where humanity begins and where like a monster begins, that line is a little bit more blurry in the regarding the stranger, which is kind of interesting to me, exactly because of the whole identity situation and being suspicious and all of that stuff. Anyways, next. The web. The web is the fear of spiders, but also manipulation. I would also like to add how it's very funny to me how like fear of spiders is like something different than fear of insects in general, which is the corruption. Like, I don't know, I just find that so funny. Like, there are insects and then there are spiders. The fun thing about this fear is that every single character in the story is kind of scared of it, is like low-key scared of it, which is so funny. The reason for that is because the web, there's two main characteristics to the web, which is like that should be noted in this situation. Which, first, the web doesn't have a clear goal, unlike the other fears. Something that I didn't mention about the other fears is that like most of these entities have as a goal to bring themselves to the world of living people and like feed of fear, without any sort of restraint. So basically cause the apocalypse and change the world in their image. And all of the fears are kind of fighting for that and fighting with each other to avoid the other one of doing that. And the web doesn't want that. The web doesn't want to end the world. The web likes the world, because in a world where people think that they have free will, the web is able to manipulate everyone and everything behind the scenes, which is the way that it likes to do. It's inherently the fear of manipulation. So you can't really like predict the web, because even if you're like, oh, maybe I should stop doing this because I'm maybe being manipulated by the web. If you think like that, maybe the web is manipulating you to think like that. And if you think that you're thinking like that because if you think that you're questioning that, maybe you're questioning the manipulation of the web because the web wants you to think like that, maybe the web wants you to think like that, and it's like a contradiction. You don't know what the web wants. So most of the characters, in a way to like deal with that, they just ignore it and pray. They just ignore, they just like hope, really hope that the web is in favor of their goals, and just keep going and pretend it doesn't exist. And it's so funny. And themes of the web are like addiction, because it makes the argument that when you're addicted, you're not really in control of your own actions. So like manipulation. Theater, because of the theater and art, like the area of arts and cinema and like production, those are things that are connected and they're part of the web's theme, because again, like manipulating behind the scenes, and has a little motif of paranoia too, like again, because that thing of like, oh, I know I'm being manipulated, but maybe I'm thinking that I am manipulating, I'm not being manipulated, you know that feeling, like that's also web related. And of course, like spiders and webs and like entire bodies appearing encased in webs and directly feeding of other people, which the entities already do, but like it has other visual aids for that regarding the web. The avatars of the web, as I said before, everyone's kind of scared of them. The possible powers that is they're kind of displayed of avatars of the web. The main one is like, of course, manipulating people, mind control. This is like the one that is displayed. It's also like shown body manipulation, being able to look more like a spider. They're very cool, actually. The web avatars are pretty cool. They're pretty badass. The one web avatar that is extremely prominent in the series is a very ominous person, exactly because she's manipulating everything behind the scenes and everyone is scared of her, and she's just there smiling and like looking at what is going on. It's really great. But yeah, the web is extremely badass. Everyone is scared of the web. It probably has something big in the series going on right now, and it's just it's a trip regarding that fear. The desolation. The desolation is the fear of massive destruction, of you losing everything you love. It's normally associated with fire, so you could say it's the fear of fire too, but like it's about the destruction, the scorching that the fire causes than the fire itself, because the fire itself has like nice things about it too. Like it's not only about eating and devouring, consuming life and everything. It's about also like warmth and life and etc. No, for the desolation, there's none of these things, because it's not really about the fire itself and more the destruction that it causes. So I kind of associate the desolation a little bit with like fear of disasters and almost of like things that you can't control that will like destroy your life. It's about you having things that you care about, that anchor you to the ground, and a life that you want to build and live and have something for yourself, and all of that be gone in a minute. So that's what the desolation is about. Interesting enough, it's the desolation has a weird like landlord thing going on in this story. Like the Magnus Archives has a lot of like anti-capitalistic messages, but I think one of the most like one of the first ones that gets very, very explicit, at the very least in my opinion, is because the Desolation avatars are like landlords because like one of them is a landlord, and then there's more about like that theme. Other one is a banker and that sort of thing. People who can take away one's entire life in a minute. A good aspect of the Desolation, though, at the very least for me, is that idea of like you have nothing to lose, like, because if you leave all your things behind, you're also free to be yourself and do things for yourself and be free to like build something new from the ashes of the things that you've burned. So in a way, that's also a good way that you can see the Desolation, in a way, that destruction that can lead to freedom. Because of that, the Desolation avatars, they have big biker energy to them, bigger biker gang energy to them. They all are very aggressive. One of them is very much a bully. It's very funny. And they're always talking about like, oh, the scorched earth and all that stuff. But they are very impulsive. The Desolation Avatar is presented as a cult. And it's really funny because it's really more of a gang who's very overly religious about a particular thing than an actual like the idea of the cult, because they're always like impulsive and fire and that stuff. Talking about that aspect, that absolutely chaotic aspect of them, one of my favorite situations in the Magnus Archives universe is how the Desolation avatars, they send one of their own, which is like one of the most powerful ones, to a web domain, to like a web territory, because that's a thing. Like, I think it's not explicitly said, but the web and the Desolation have like absolutely opposites ideals, because one is all about manipulating and have things around you, etc., and the other one is about like absolutely burning everything to the ground, have no ties and go forth and etc. So in a way, a lot of people consider them opposites of each other, and the Desolation sent one of their owns to, it was a child, by the way, a child of their own, to a web territory just because they wanted to see what would happen. They're like, we have this extremely powerful child and we have an enemy, what should we do? And they just censure that no plan, just want to see what happens, and that's insane. Thematically wise, it has a big connection with candles and of course fire and destruction and landlords and that stuff. And it's also called in the story the Lilas Flame, which is fitting because again, it's like fire but without the good stuff. So Lilas Flame. Note, once I was talking about a concept that I thought it was really interesting, that once I was discussing with like other people from the fandom, was like the idea of having like ice Desolation avatars. That would be really fun because ice also burns, ice also destroys. That would be a very good concept. It never happened on the series, but I feel like that could happen. The hunt. The hunt is quite sexy. The hunt is the fear of being hunted. The story says that that's like an animalistic type of fear that is more common among animals, but honestly, the series also shows quite a few examples and themes where that sort of fear can apply to human beings. Like, I think my favorite, like for example, the hunt, which is the fear of being hunted, is consistently used throughout the story as a metaphor for police brutality. It has kind of a thematic of like you hunt monsters, but actually you're also a monster, or like being corrupted by that fake feeling of like, I'm protecting someone, I'm the good guy here, they're bad, and because of this I should be going after them, when actually it's just like a power situation and you're actually super bad. That's one of the themes of it. There's also in my interpretation, there's also an interpretation of like cancel culture, that idea of always be hunting for something to judge and to point your fingers at and just ruin people's life. That desire, like, it's interesting because the series presents it as a fear that is very animalistic, but at the same time I think you can see in day-to-day life that desire of like ripping apart other people and want to feel superior, and that sort of thing is very Hunt. Interesting thing about the Hunt, two interesting things about like the creatures of the Hunt. First of all, inside the Hunt, like on the spectrum of the Hunt, is some like known monsters, or at the very least, like in the story, those are just names that people gave to those monsters because of association and stuff. But inside the Hunt, there's vampires and werewolves. That's and but the main thing about the Hunt is the hunters. The hunters, which they are the avatar of the Hunt. And the interesting thing about them is that they go after other avatars, including other people of the Hunt. Because of its nature, it kind of just, the thing about the Hunt is that part of it is kind of hunting within itself, kind of that sort of betrayal, and also like just going against everything that you see. And because of that, the Hunt is always fighting itself, which is super funny to me. And it also creates a situation where most of the hunters become like avatars without knowing. They're just like in their heads, so like, oh, I'm fighting those monsters, and then they before they know it, they're also a monster. They're all also dependent of an entity. And also like the werewolves in the series are normally those hunters who become more hunt than like human. Also, other interesting thing about the Hunt avatars, they are some of the only like beings in this universe that can actively hurt other avatars. Because one thing about the people who serve the entities is that they're very powerful within the things that they can do and how much they can endure, like knives and that sort of thing. You won't kill them, but you can like hurt them in some sort of ways, depending on which fear it is. And you can also like trap them and etc. But the most effective and quick way of doing so is having a hunter, because a hunter will immediately be able to kill any avatar because of the power of the entity behind it. And that's like their main thing of the series. Because of that, a lot of Hunt avatars are kind of like hired, not hired, a lot of them, the situations used in the series to exemplify this were blackmail, but they're used by other entity people as a weapon, basically, to go against their enemies and other avatars, etc. So a group of avatars of one entity may have like a single hunter with them, with the goal to like attack people from a different entity. The slaughter. The slaughter is the fear of violence, which is different from the fear of being haunted that we just talked about. Like, the fear of violence is like unnecessary violence for nothing, just pure rage. It kind of has the theme of being just like absolutely awful violent stuff for meaningless reasons. Because of that, it's extremely associated with war in the series. Most of these slaughter statements, they're like historical statements talking about some sort of war, and there's the soldiers, and then there's like and then there's violence, because violence and war and etc. It's also like motif wise, it's very associated with music. It's kind of has a symbology of like war and those things being sort of like the music of violence, and how it's addicting and people just do it, and it has its rhythm. If you can understand what I'm trying to say, it kind of tries to present it like that. And because of that, the slaughter is very much related to music, and particular to bagpipes, like Scottish bagpipes. That's something that is related to it. I kind of wish there were more statements of this letter that aren't directly related to war, because there are some, and those are very interesting. Like, there's one, the most iconic one is probably about a band that if you listen to their music, you get immediately out of your mind violence and start punching and stabbing people and like hurting yourself immediately because of that music. And honestly, amazing. Wish there were a little bit more of that in a way, but the statements are really good anyways. As for avatars of this lore, there aren't a lot of examples. There's a few that are like mentioned here and there in statements. They're mostly like war soldiers and things like that. There is a situation in the story of a recurrent character that gets like there starts being heavily influenced by this slaughter, and with her as a like view as a model, we could assume that most slaughter avatars, they probably are very angry in general. They're probably extremely angry and extremely willing to stab all the time. It's good side. I guess like the music side, the thing of like the rhythm and the drive and the adrenaline, I guess you can see as like good themes, I suppose. And like historic stuff and like how the human nature works anyways. But there aren't a lot of direct examples of these lot of avatars because of that. I'm not sure what their power is. I think they can probably like make people get really angry and have some sort of emotional connection linked to people with that anger side, but that's my best guess. It's not very it isn't very explicit on that part on which powers does the slaughter avatars get. The flesh is probably the other nasty one of the Magnus archives. Like there's a few very disgusting statements about it. It's the fear of it's basically the fear of gore, the fear of like meat and blood, and also particularly of being eaten. The flesh reminds me of that one Tumblr post that is like, why are you all afraid of skeletons? You should be afraid of the meat because we're all covered by red, alive, pulsating, bloody meat. Like, yeah, it's that Tumblr post and it's an entity. The themes of the Flash, it has a theme of like not feeling comfortable in your own body or wanting to like have a better body in a way. It has that theme of you like not being satisfied with your own body and ended up being like super uncomfortable and fearful about it, like being super conscious of your weight or being super conscious or wanting to be super buff. And I've seen people on Tumblr saying that it's the trans entity as well with the spiral because of this theme. It also has again the theme of like being eaten. There was a little arc about how like technically meat is meat and like we are also made of meat even though we eat also meat from animals, but we are also meat, you know? There's two very prominent flesh avatars in the story. One we don't talk about, and the other one is like it has big jock energy to it. Actually, the other one also has a little bit of jock energy. I guess you could say that Avatars of the Flesh have a little bit of like jock energy and extremely chaotic energy at the very least. There's the other one that is very prominent. There's the big pig. There's an Avatar of the Flesh that is actually just a big fucking pig. And it's really good. I love the monster pig. It's the best character monster pig. Woohoo! It's also another one of those fears that the series presented as kind of animalistic fear, which is like the fear of you being eaten, which is the fear that animals have regarding humans. So it has also like a thematic of industrial meat and the idea of being carried to the slaughter and that sort of thing. there was one episode that used it as a metaphor for capitalism, because this is all also, it's always used as a metaphor of capital, about capitalism in in some way, saying how like we are in our own little line to the slaughter, wishing to be useful to the system, but actually all the pieces are going to be thrown away. There's something regarding those, along those lines in the story too. So it has that industrial sort of like killing and eating sort of theme to it, and also because it's regarding like the body and meat and etc., it has a lot of body horror. I feel like even if you take away the aspect of like, oh, it's an animal fear, oh, you're being eaten, and it can also be applied to human beings and that sort of thing, even if you take away that, like everyone is kind of, the fear of blood and the fear of seeing open wounds and the fear of gore and that sort of like result of violence is a very common fear. So that gory little dread that we get from that, from the gore, is something that is very, that is the flesh in a way, which is, I really like this fear, because I feel like it's something that everyone is kind of scared of. But unlike a lot of those other fears, it's not, let's say, the main thing in a story to make scary. Like, it's normally a secondary aspect of the story. Like the gore and the body horror normally is an aspect and a consequence of another situation and another fear. And it's normally not used as like the main thing. Again, reminds me of the Tumblr post of like, why are y'all scared of skeletons? There's fucking meat. Meat is more scary than skeletons, which I think it's fits what I think of why this fear is so cool. The extinction. It's a controversial one because the series doesn't make it exactly clear if it's a real fear or not, or at the very least until a little while ago, because in my interpretation, what happened a little while ago was pretty much the confirmation that it is a fear. But in the story, it's some characters think that this fear doesn't exist, and in the fandom, some people don't count the extinction as one of the fears. To which I say bullshit. The extinction validates me because I was a child that had so many nightmares about this fear. I could not. I was thinking about it all the time. And when I saw in the story that there was a whole fear about that, I felt so valid. It's so valid. It's different. It is a different fear, okay? It is something. The extinction is the fear of the end of the world. But then you would say, aren't all of these things technically working towards the end of the world? Aren't like a lot of these, aren't the fear of the end of the world just fear of death? No, it's different. It's about like the fear of humanity ending, or like the planet fading away, and like the life on Earth becoming unrecognizable, but time is still goes on. Is the fear that we have, the dread that we have when we look in the news, and once again we see that climate change is still going. It's the dread that I feel when I see that my government stop trying to stop the fires that are going on in the Pantanal. I'm Brazilian, by the way. And I'm mentioning this mid-video because everyone should know about it, because this is stupid, and those fires are going on in our woods for like months and no one talks about it. It's that dread. The dread that the world felt when the atomic bomb was released for the first time. The dread that like the world can end at any second because of like something. Because of that, the extinction has big like mankind's themes to it: technology, climate change, pollution. Just again, very much the idea of the things that mankind made just ultimately being its ruin, or the things of or the idea of other things that aren't mankind to get rid of us or to replace us. It's an extremely emblematic and mysterious figure in the Magnus Archives universe. There aren't any like known examples of extinction avatars in the series, but I'm gonna assume that an extinction avatar is just the Onseller. For real though, it's probably like similar, something similar to pollution, to like the pollution from Good Omens, probably. And alas, we come to the end. The entity, the end, which is the entity of the fear of death. Very straightforward, this one. There's a lot of symbolism regarding paths of deaths and myths of death, and basically how like death is inescapable, and like that's the thing of this fear. Unlike a lot of the other ones, the fear of death manifests in a much more chill way. It's kind of like the statements of the end are very much like reminders that, you know, everyone dies eventually. Even though there is like a few specifics to it, like some people might have actual paranoia and stop enjoying life and that sort of stuff because they can't stop thinking of how they're gonna die, how they're gonna die, how they're gonna die, and it ends up like feeding this fear even more. Another characteristic of this fear is that just like the web, it doesn't have as a goal to start the apocalypse in its name, because basically everyone, as a law of life, everyone will ending up, everyone will have an end, everyone will die. So by the end of the day, the end will claim us all, and because of this, it has no interest in like shaping the world in its name, because a world that is shaped towards the end is just nothing, and by the end of the day, everything goes to nothing eventually. That's the thing of the end. It doesn't mind. Everything will die eventually. There's one example of an end avatar of the story, and his personality is very much that. Very, very chill, very like, oh, death, different paths and different things all end up in death anyways, no matter which different choices you make. It's all kind of connected and related anyway, because everything will die in the end. It's, again, there's like one example of it, and his power is like he can see when people die and brings people to their death. I will say though, like, I'm gonna assume that there's probably an end avatar somewhere that has powers of like necromancy or summon ghosts, because there's a book in the story. There's like magical books in the Magnus Archives related to these entities, and one of the end books can like trap souls basically of people when they die, and you can summon them. So I'm gonna assume that there's probably like some avatar of the end that can do something similar to that, probably. Another interesting thing about them is that like they're the hardest types of avatar to kill. Most of the other avatars, they can like, you can kind of trap them or find some sort of weakness or something like that. For the end avatars, the only way to kill them is with a hunter to go there and kill them, because most of the time, because they're related to death, so it would be hard to probably end themselves. It's killing, an aspect of killing, of death, you know. It is hard. It's probably pretty hard, you know. It's probably also, considering that the fears, they're related to human emotions, you could probably also assume that it's probably the oldest one as well, because all of these fears, they're kind of related indirectly with death anyways. It's kind of like always there in a way. It sure is like an interesting fear.